President Yoon replaces all three of his top aides, naming current Director of National Policy Lee Kwan-sup as his new Chief of Staff, Vice Foreign Minister Chang Ho-jin as his new National Security Advisor, and more. On the other side of the peninsula, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un gave orders to speed up war preparations during the regime's key plenary meeting. South Korea's intel agency, meanwhile, assigns high odds to Pyongyang engaging in provocations early next year. Industrial production last month turned around and increased due to greater outputs in semiconductors. It's December 28, 2023. This is News Center. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yoon Jung-min. We begin with the top office shakeup tonight. President Yoon replaced all three of his top aides, naming first Vice Foreign Minister Chang Ho-jin, a career diplomat, as his new National Security Advisor, and current Director of National Policy Lee Kwan-sup as his new Chief of Staff. This ahead of his third year in office next year. Correspondent Kim Do-yeon reports.
New names for all three of President Yoon Suk-yeol's highest-ranking aides were announced on Thursday. First, the current First Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chang Ho-jin, has been named the new National Security Advisor. He's a career diplomat who also was the ambassador to Russia before his latest position.
Security today extends beyond self-national defense to vital diplomatic relations with allies in other countries. The new National Security Advisor, we believe, is ideally suited to support the president in these crucial areas of diplomacy and security.
The appointment comes as the current National Security Advisor, Cho Tae-yong, is going through the parliamentary hearing process to take the vacant position of National Intelligence Service Chief. Chang said he's looking to continue pushing on from the diplomatic and security strategy of the administration, including strengthening cooperation with the U.S. and the new Indo-Pacific strategy.
In the 30 years since the end of the Cold War, the international order has reached a new phase with emerging geopolitical shifts. Assuming this responsibility during such a transitional period makes me feel an even greater sense of duty.
He also emphasized building on the audacious initiative that President Yoon laid out for his policy towards North Korea and other security issues. The current ambassador to Germany, Kim Hong-gyun, will replace Chang as the first vice minister. Kim is a known expert on North Korean issues with a stint as a special representative for Korean Peninsula Peace and Security Affairs, also known as the top nuclear envoy. In the meantime, the current presidential chief of staff, Kim Dae-gi, announced his resignation, saying President Yoon has named his current Director of National Policy, Lee Kwan-sup, to take the role effective January 1st. The new appointment came less than a month after a reshuffle that created the new Director of National Policy role. Lee was the first one to fill the post. He's a career public servant with known expertise in nuclear energy policy.
People's livelihoods are extremely challenging and macroeconomic risks still remain. I will work diligently. Please continue to encourage, support, and also critique me.
Replacing Lee as the Director of National Policy is an outsider. Song Tae-yoon, a professor of economics at Yonsei University, has been named. The top office says different economy-related government branches have long been asking for his insights, giving him experience both in theory and practice. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
President Yoon has called on South Korea's frontline soldiers to act first and report later in the event of an enemy provocation, with North Korea continuing to advance its nuclear weapons and missile programs. The South Korean leader on Thursday visited the Republic of Korea Army's 5th Infantry Division to inspect the military preparedness at the front line of the heavily militarized inter-Korean border. Commanding their sense of duty during the holiday season, Yoon said the South Korean people expect a strong and dependable army and ordered they respond immediately and resolutely to an enemy provocation under the principle of acting first and reporting later. Also holding a meeting and a luncheon with the soldiers, the commander-in-chief promised to dramatically improve welfare for soldiers. With North Korea's key party meeting underway, leader Kim Jong-un has called for speedier war preparations. South Korea's intelligence agency, meanwhile, says the regime will likely ramp up its provocations ahead of the general election in April next year. Our defense correspondent, Choi Min-jung, has more.
North Korean leader Kim Jong-un on Wednesday reportedly called for efforts to speed up war preparations on the second-day session of the regime's year-end key plenary meeting. According to North Korea's state-run Korean Central News Agency, Kim set forth the militant task for the People's Army and the munitions industry, nuclear weapons and civil defense sectors to further accelerate war preparations. The KCNA also reported that the order comes amid the severe political and military situation on the Korean peninsula, caused by unprecedented acts of confrontation from the U.S. and its followers. The North Korean leader also vowed to expand and develop strategic cooperation with the anti-imperialist independent countries. Pundits say this could mean that Pyongyang could further strengthen ties with countries such as Russia. Kim is also expected to issue a key message at the ongoing meeting, including a New Year's Day address. Experts believe he will likely deliver a hostile message aimed at South Korea and the U.S., as well as measures to ramp up military capabilities.
So we can presume that they will continue to develop missiles and to develop all sorts of other defense preparations. And it's very astutely done to be as cost-effective as possible, and particularly to project a larger image.
South Korea's foreign ministry expressed deep regret.
North Korea is probably well aware that it has been squandering its key resources on strengthening its military capabilities, including nuclear weapons and missiles, making its economy and the livelihoods of its people more difficult.
Regardless, the regime is expected to carry out military provocations from early 2024. The National Intelligence Service predicted Thursday that North Korea is highly likely to engage in provocative actions ahead of South Korea's general election in April, as it did during previous elections in 2016 and 2020. Considering North Korea's past behaviors and recent level of threats, the agency vowed to make efforts to establish early warning and preparedness with relevant ministries. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
South Korea's top court has once again upheld two separate rulings that ordered Japanese companies Mitsubishi Heavy Industries to compensate the Korean victims of wartime forced labor during Japan's colonial rule from 1910 to 1945. The court made similar rulings in separate cases last week. Our foreign affairs correspondent Bae Eun-ji has the details.
In September 1944, Mr. Hong and others were taken to Mitsubishi Heavy Industries' munitions factory in Hiroshima and were forced to work in harsh conditions before returning home, after the atomic bombing in the area in August the following year. Since then, they not only endure social and economic difficulties, but also suffer from health issues after being exposed to radiation. In 2013, Mr. Hong, along with other surviving victims and families of the late victims, filed a suit against the Japanese company, demanding compensation of 100 million Korean won, or about $77,000 per person. Another victim of forced labor, Mr. Lee, also filed a suit against a Japanese company called Hitachi Josen in 2015. Lee worked at the firm's shipyard from September 1944. South Korea's Supreme Court on Thursday ruled in favor of these two cases, ordering Mitsubishi and Hitachi to pay between 50 million to 150 million Korean won to each victim. That's about $38,000 to $111,000. Thursday's rulings are the second by the top court since 2018, when it made landmark rulings on separate forced labor cases, ordering two Japanese companies to compensate Korean victims, which strained diplomatic relations between Seoul and Tokyo. The top court upheld similar rulings last week, ordering Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and Nippon Steel to pay a maximum of 150 million won, or around $115,000 to each victim in compensation. But the Japanese companies are likely to continue refusing to pay, and the Korean government is expected to compensate the victims instead, using funds procured through a public foundation. The plan was announced earlier this year to improve relations with Japan.
In line with the government compensation plan announced in March, We plan to pay the compensation and damages for the delay through the Foundation for Victims of Forced Mobilization by Imperial Japan.
With such a plan already in place and taking into account Japan's continued denial, it's unlikely that the Japanese firms will pay the compensation themselves. Japanese companies have yet to pay the previously ordered compensation, claiming the statute of limitations for the cases has expired. But last week, for the very first time, the court clarified that this would not be allowed. Peunji, Arirang News.
A military education textbook recently published by the Defense Ministry has caused a stir with its description of South Korea's Dokdo Island. The renewed educational material for soldiers' mental combat power describes Dokdo as an area under territorial dispute. This description goes against South Korea's stance that Dokdo is Korea's territory, historically, geographically, and under international law. President Yoon reprimanded the ministry, saying this must not happen, and ordered an immediate correction. The ministry announced that it would recall all the distributed textbooks and promptly address the problem. Today, the opposition-led National Assembly passed two contentious special investigation proposals, one over stock manipulation allegations involving First Lady Kim Gon-hee, and the other over a corruption scandal centered around a local development project. President Yoon is expected to use his veto power once again amid rising political tensions. Shin Se-byuk reports.
In a unanimous decision on Thursday, the opposition-led National Assembly unilaterally passed two contentious special probe proposals. One of them involves First Lady Kim Gon-hee's alleged role in manipulating stock prices. The presidential office was quick to respond, stating that President Yoon will promptly exercise his right to request reconsideration. Kim has been accused of impacting the share prices of Deutsche Motors, a car dealership from 2009 to 2012. The second investigation focuses on the 5 billion won club related to a corruption scandal in the Daejang-dong development project in Seongnam, south of Seoul. Both proposals were approved in a plenary session where lawmakers from the PPP were absent. These two proposals were fast-tracked by the parliament back in April, requiring expedited deliberations, and were automatically submitted to Thursday's plenary session in line with the National Assembly Act. During the session, the ruling People Power Party criticized the bills as politically driven, aimed at influencing next year's April general election.
The sole intent of these proposals is to prompt the president to exercise his right of reconsideration, aiming to leverage this for political contention in the upcoming general election.
In contrast, the opposition parties argued that any attempt by the president to exercise his reconsideration right could backfire on the Yoon administration.
If the president tries to scrap these bills using his veto power, the people will no longer tolerate it and will demand the resignation of the Yoon administration.
Should President Yoon use his veto power this time, it would mark his fourth use of such authority, with his most recent one exercised earlier this month to reject the pro-labor Yellow Envelope Bill and 3 amendments related to broadcasting law. If a veto is exercised this time, it is anticipated that the rivalry between the ruling and opposition parties will become more intense in the lead-up to the general election. Shin Se-byuk, Arirang News.
Korea's industrial output rebounded in November on the back of a jump in chip production, but facility investment lost more ground. Park Go-nu explains.
South Korea's overall industrial production last month saw an increase thanks to a jump in manufacturing industry production. According to Statistics Korea on Thursday, total industrial production rose 0.5% on month, a contrast from the month before when it dropped by 1.8%. The growth was mainly attributed to greater output in manufacturing sectors, including semiconductors, which rose by over 3% on month, the highest increase since August. In detail, chip production, particularly DRAM and flash memory chips, saw a jump of 12.8%, recovering from negative figures in October. A Statistics Korea official said greater demand for AI chips, as well as the base effect, was behind the increase. Meanwhile, an official from the Finance Ministry also spoke in detail about how semiconductors contribute to recovery in the manufacturing industry.
Chip shipments also rose 30%, while inventories fell by 3.8%, meaning the overall chip industry is heading in the right direction of recovery.
He also said the situation is quite positive as inventory has been decreasing for the third straight month, a situation not seen for 13 months. He also said the government is tentatively expecting some $10 billion in terms of chip exports in December, the highest for this year, and the first time in 15 months it would surpass the $10 billion mark. Retail sales, a key gauge of private spending, also soared by 1% in November compared to the month before, thanks to higher automobile sales figures. Statistics Korea said increased consumption during several discount events in November, including the 2023 Korea Sales Festa, contributed to jumps in spending. While sales saw its biggest increase in 9 months, investment decreased once again in November. But the finance ministry said they are expecting investment to rise in the near future, as it normally increases following export figure increases. Park Go-nu, Arirang News.
South Korea has had some economic ups and downs this year. Our economics correspondent Shin Ha-young has a wrap-up of the economy in the year 2023 and what to expect in 2024 through key numbers.
For South Korea, the year 2023 was not easy on the economic front, but at the same time, it was a year where the country witnessed some positive signs. The first key number is 2%. It's the Bank of Korea's target level of inflation, and as widely expected, one of the economic keywords of 2023 was, of course, inflationary pressure. The Consumer Price Index, a key gauge of inflation, shows signs of slowing in the first half of 2023, with the on-year inflation rate dipping as low as 2.3% in July. But in the following months, inflation increased to 3% level due to higher oil costs and rising prices for some agricultural goods. In efforts to bring inflation down to its target level, South Korea's central bank kept the key interest rate unchanged at 3.5% for its 7th straight meeting. Meanwhile, the U.S. Fed has maintained its rate in the 5.25% to 5.5% range for a third consecutive time. With the Fed hinting at rate cuts for 2024, market watchers also expect possible rate cuts from the Bank of Korea. The key interest rate gap between South Korea and the U.S., which stands at 2 percentage points, will continue to be a factor to keep our eyes on in 2024 based on the monetary policy directions of the two countries. The second key figure is 13 months. South Korea's economic backbone, its exports, have been sluggish amid continued weak global demand for semiconductor chips, as well as a relatively slow reopening in China. However, toward the end of 2023, exports began showing some promising signs. Korea's exports in October saw an on-year rebound for the first time in 13 months, thanks to greater shipments of automobiles and ships. Exports in November remained robust due to a rebound in semiconductor exports after 16 months, along with a rebound in rechargeable batteries and petrochemicals. And even though exports to China continued to decline for the 18th consecutive month, the overall trade balance as of November maintained a surplus for the 6th straight months. The last key figure is 1.4%. With such performances, the OECD, International Monetary Fund, Bank of Korea, and the South Korean government all forecast economic growth for 2023 at 1.4%, while the Asian Development Bank predicts growth of 1.3%. Then what will the South Korean economy look like in 2024? The general consensus among economic pundits is that the country's economy will expand by over 2% in 2024. The estimated figure from the OECD has been revised up to 2.3% from its previous report, with exports likely to pick up with a recovery in chip demand. However, there are various factors that Korea needs to focus on from both at home and from abroad. Key external uncertainties include financial instability due to global inflation and sustained lingering high key interest rates and geopolitical tensions arising from conflicts like the Israel-Hamas war and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Additionally, concerns involve a deepening economic downturn in China, as well as the pace of recovery in the global chip industry. On the domestic front, high levels of household debt could continue to weigh on private consumption and investment. But hopefully the nation's strong resilience and the positive signals in 2023 will pave the way for a tangible economic recovery in 2024.
In the Middle East, a toxic blend of disease and hunger is looking to kill more people in Gaza than Israel's counteroffensive targeted at Hamas. Now, this is according to the global health body. Lee Seung-jae covers its concerns.
With many Gazans left with minimal medical assistance due to the ongoing armed conflict in the war-torn region, the World Health Organization said Wednesday that diseases are rapidly increasing in the Gaza Strip as sanitary conditions have become extremely poor. The UN Health Agency says there have been more than 100,000 cases of diarrhea since mid-October, and half of the patients are children under the age of 5. Also, the number of sick people continues to increase rapidly. With many living in close quarters in crowded camps, the number of respiratory infection cases in Gaza has exceeded 150,000, increasing 7-fold in just 45 days. The WHO added that other illnesses such as meningitis, skin rash, and chickenpox have also been reported, and many residents appear to have symptoms of jaundice and even hepatitis. According to the World Food Program, all 2.2 million residents of the Gaza Strip are in a state of acute food insecurity, adding that the region is currently in a level 4 emergency crisis out of a 5-tier classification. Level 3 or higher is considered an acute food crisis. Combined with the food shortage, Palestinians are also facing drinking water shortages as facilities capable of supplying water are repeatedly damaged. According to the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs on Wednesday, a water pipe passing east of Khan Yunis was seriously damaged by an Israeli airstrike on Monday, cutting off drinking water to the entire region. The damaged water pipe was one of 2 water pipes supplying drinking water from Israel to southern Gaza. UN organizations fear that the water shortage will exacerbate the dire health conditions of Gazans, especially children who are particularly vulnerable. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
The number of foreign tourists visiting South Korea in November marked the second highest number this year. The Korea Tourism Organization says the number reached over 1.11 million last month. That's a 142% increase compared to last year. There have been over 1 million visitors each month since July. Tourists from Japan accounted for the largest proportion with 278,000, the highest monthly figure of Japanese tourists recorded this year. From January to November, the total number of foreign tourists reached over 9.9 million. In sports news, the South Korean squad for the upcoming AFC Asian Cup in Qatar has been announced. Jurgen Klinsmann, the Korea men's national team manager, announced his 26-man squad on Thursday at a press conference. Tottenham Hotspur's Son Heung-min will lead the pack, which includes 12 Europe-based players, including Bayern Munich defender Kim Min-jae, Paris Saint-Germain's Lee Gang-in, and Wolverhampton Wanderers forward Hwang Hee-chan. Eyeing to win its first Asian Cup title in 64 years, South Korea will face Bahrain, Jordan, and Malaysia in the group stage. The tournament will run from January 12th to February 10th.
Dusty air conditions have made eyes and noses stuffy and dry all day. For the first time this winter, the Seoul Metropolitan Government has issued emergency fine dust reduction measures, which will be in place until 9 p.m. tonight. In these areas, the operation hours of public workplaces and construction sites will be shortened, and a two-day vehicle system for public institutions will be implemented. Ultrafine dust, which is harmful to the respiratory system, will be in full swing until tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. Make sure to wear a mask over KF80 when you go out. Thus, relatively mild winter weather will continue tomorrow. Temperatures will rise to 6 degrees in Seoul, surpassing the previous temperatures by 2 to 5 degrees. Morning temperatures in Seoul will start off at -2 degrees. Throughout the day, Seoul will get up to 6, Gwangju and Daegu 9 degrees Celsius. On Sunday, the last day of this year, it is possible to have heavy snow warning issued in central inland areas and mountainous areas of Gangwon-do province. That's all for Korea. Here are the weather conditions around the world.
That is News Center for tonight. Thank you for watching. A panel session coming up.
하나, 둘, 셋.
Hey, Mr. Cupid, make sure you listen to what I say. I may be stupid or quite naive.
끝없이 쏟아지는 포토스팟. 휴대폰 한 대로 감당할 수 있겠니?
Arrow straight through my heart.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Federico Cuello. I am the ambassador of the Dominican Republic in the Republic of Korea. Arirang is the one channel in which ambassadors have a say. Ambassadors' opinions are taken into consideration. Ambassadors can promote what they are doing. I am truly grateful to be asked to speak for Arirang. I hope Arirang continues and diplomat talks continues as well, because really it is the one window in my 6 postings as ambassador I have found to speak about my work and to speak about those issues that are of relevance for the Dominican Republic and for Korea. And I look forward to coming back as many times as possible during the remaining time I have here in Korea, resonating with the world with Arirang.
Hello everyone, it's Thursday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. The year 2023 was indeed a tough one for the global economy. As part of efforts to contain worldwide inflation, major banks had to stick to a restrictive monetary policy, which led to concerns over the unemployment rate and sluggish business activities. Though exports are showing slow signs of recovery, South Korea too had long suffered from continued high interest rates, and thus the economy is expected to grow in the low 1% range next year. How has the global economy done this year, and what are uncertainties lying ahead for both the global and South Korean economy? For this, we have invited Professor Oh Jun-seok, Dean of Sungmyung Business School. Welcome, Professor Oh.
Good evening.
And we also have Professor Hwa-Kyun Kim from the Mays Business School at Texas A&M University. Good to see you again, Professor Kim.
Good to see you again. Thanks for the invite.
All right, thank you for joining the show. First question, let's talk about with OECD's data. The OECD cut this year's global economy's growth rate to 2.9% and maintained next year's projection at 2.7%. How do you assess this year's global economic growth, and what is your view on next year's?
As you mentioned in the very early part, this year the global economy has experienced significant the difficulties. But despite that, I think has been doing really well. And due to the there's two wars going on and also the tighter financial conditions, clearly the OECD and some other agencies start lowering down the projections for this year. But it's almost at the end of this year now. And also the next year is going to be relatively lower growth rate prospects for most of the countries. So if you look at the OECD report, they also have projections for 2025, and actually that's about 3%. So kind of pattern is now it has been doing well, but slightly going down, and the next year is going to be slumping further down a bit, and then it's going to have like better and full recovery in 2025. I think that's many the experts' outlook, and I tend to agree with it.
All right, it's going to recover in 2025. Now, Professor Oh, like our Professor Kim already mentioned, we have two wars raging in the Middle East and Europe. If those wars become expanded, how would that affect the global economy in 2024 and 2025?
No doubt, negatively affected the overall economy in 2024. What worries more, in accordance with geopolitical risk, is global financial outlook would be worsened as sequence. Talking about overall economy, global economic growth will slow even more in 2024 due to high interest rate, increased energy prices, and a market slowdown of China. And the U.S. economic growth could slow to 2.6% next year from 2.9% this year. While economists generally agree the world will avoid falling into recession, they highlighted the possibility of a mild recession. I agree. Also as well, this is a mild recession 2024, especially in Europe and in the U.S. With the Fed raising interest rate at a breakneck pace to fight inflation, U.S. economy could barely manage to handle the situation now. The strength of the economy in 2024 will be driven by consumer spending, which accounts almost roughly 70% of U.S. GDP. Despite chances of a soft landing, here what I mean is curbing inflation without killing job opportunity, uncertainty due to wars make the future hard to predict. So long as the labor market remains strong, consumers are likely to continue their spending spree. There comes a signal, especially in the United States, they could deserve to enjoy both modest growth and disinflation simultaneously, recklessly by increasing home lending. Korea also has stocked up lots of assignment of project financing risks to solve in the financial industry. It is not a time for consumers to inflate consumption, but it's high time to reduce debt balance as quickly as possible. Let's not forget that falling inflation and resilient growth are not a common combination for most economies. One of the two might only be an economic illusion.
All right, I see. So there could be mild recession in 2024, and two wars right now raging, and the war could be one of uncertainties. All right, well, Professor Kim, let's delve deeper into each country's economic situation here. Though high inflation led to a continued tightening policy from the Fed, both hiring and spending remain solid in the U.S., showing how robust it is. How did you see the economy in the U.S. this year?
Well, the very early part of this year's projections, most of the experts, including their own, the forecasting agencies, have very negative views. So it's like 0.9% growth or maximum 1%. But despite that, I think the GDP is likely to grow about like 2.6% and netting out inflation, right? So this is huge number for the economies like the US. And I think it is quite related to the robust households, actually balance sheets, because that's partly coming from the strong wage growth of the US. The Fed actually was worried about the too strong labor markets because that actually can overinflate the economy because the monetary policy was kind of tightening. But still, I think this was working well, probably because the firms made enough money, I think, in 2022 and 2021, and they used that actually to hire more people because the excessive labor demand actually was there in the U.S. And that probably contributed positively to the surprisingly positive economic growth of the U.S. in 2023. I don't think they have very positive view on 2024, but still, I think they managed to well this year, definitely.
I see. So the overall, the U.S. economy was quite robust. And that being said, Professor Oh, some expect the U.S. economy's such a resilience to continue, making a soft landing and returning to the Fed's 2% target without a sharp rise in unemployment a possible scenario. However, others also say there is a recession to come next year. What's your forecast for the U.S. economy in 2024?
Yes, there are too many forecasts. I take in the middle, not go to the extreme. According to the recent report by Bank of America, expect a GDP growth of 1.2% in 2024, 0.6 percentage point above its prior forecast, and unemployment rate of 4.2%, down from 4.4% of the prior forecast, and inflation of 2.2%, down from 2.4%. Might be Professor Kim knows better and feel better the atmosphere of the U.S. economy deeply inside. I'd like to see the U.S. economy from outside. In brief, I could draw a more optimistic picture based upon the better than expected performance of the global economy in 2023. And the fact that GDP growth and employment have held relatively steady in major economies facing extreme inflation. What is more encouraging is the volatility of a global supply chain that dominate the U.S. economy over the pandemic period to diminish. In 2023, the predictions were unanimously a recession, as Professor Kim commented, in heading to the 2023. There are negative forecasts. Consumers struggled with high prices amid the rising inflation, may fear a downturn as severe as 2008. But the U.S. economy has done better in 2024. U.S. growth is still growing, but could outperform expectations in the first half of 2024. Many of the drivers U.S. inflation have been related to supply shock caused by supply chain disruption, mostly comes from China. Now that supply side risk insulation have helped to bring inflation down more rapidly. It opens the door for inflation to lower down without putting policymakers into the corner of demand destruction. Looking into the late 2024 and 2025, overall growth will return to more stable pre-pandemic rates. Inflation will hover at around 2%, and the Fed will lower rate to just below 3%. This will contrast sharply with a recessionary condition in Europe and even in China.
All right, thank you for your projection, Professor Oh. Now, Professor Kim, I'd like to delve a little bit deeper into Fed's decision. It hinted at possible rate cuts to come next year, at least once, although many believe there will be a total of 3. The question is when and to what extent. Could you give us some scenarios and factors the Fed would consider before pivoting?
Right. As I just typically talk about this, if you look at the Fed Watch the Fed futures, the probability of the lowering rate, clearly probably next March is going to be the first time they start lowering. Typically, monetary policy looks at inflation and economic growth. So if inflation is above the target, and then they tend to increase the interest rate, and if the growth is actually too high, then they also increase the interest rate. And then also they also look at the financial market conditions, so that if the liquidity conditions are bad, then clearly they try to inject more money by lowering the rate. So these kind of things will be the main factors clearly. So if they think that inflation is going down faster than they think, then maybe they can actually lower the interest rate a bit early. And also if the growth is getting slower than they expected, then they may lower the interest rate early. Obviously, the opposite story is also true in that if inflation is not going down very fast, then clearly they'll try to maintain the high interest rate a little longer so that they can actually keep just tightening the economy. So it's going to all depend on the inflation and the growth news. Of course, the market condition, global market condition is going to be another factor, but that's probably going to be the last one in terms of priority.
All right, I see. So rate cut could first come in March, but later on, the Fed would have to consider many variables, including especially the inflation and growth rate. All right. Well, Professor Kim, we have been keep talking about U.S. economy, but China, the world's second largest economy, also affects the global economy as well. And so I'd like to talk about Beijing. It had to go through deflation and a real estate crisis, and is still struggling to put those issues behind them. How is China's economy right now, and will Beijing continue to struggle next year?
I think it's probably a good idea to look at some data. So I just looked at the OECD report, the same report that you mentioned today. And China's real GDP growth has been around like 6.8% between 2013 and 2019. And then in 2022, 3%, and then projected to be about 5% in 2023, and 4.7% in 2024, and 4.2% in 2024. Of course, this is just a projection, so who knows? But at least as you can see, the pattern is it has been pretty high, around like 7%, and then it's going down like to 4%. So you can see that it's a big drop over the next 3-4 years. So clearly, China is cooling down. And after all, China has been growing for like 3 decades, like in the speed of like 15% per year, which is crazy in a sense. So given the size of the economy, right? So I think that basically tells a lot about the Chinese economy probably for the next few years, because as South Korea also experienced a bit of a slowing down in the 2000, although I think the stable maintenance actually of the growth rate existed. So that China probably has to go through something similar. And given that they really overinflated the economy in the past decade, especially through the real estate market and some of the other industries, heavily backed by government, I think, it's probably inevitable to see some big slowdown. Hopefully, I think it's a little more stable than volatile. But I think, it's probably going to be the reality that we will see some slowdown, probably up to 3.5% for the next 5 years or something.
All right, I see. So China could have to go through a long-term slowdown, as our Professor Kim just mentioned. All right. Well, Professor Oh, moving on to South Korea's economy. Though it climbed back to above 3% after falling as low as 2.3% in July, South Korea put a great deal of effort into containing inflation this year. Will the rate be able to reach the 2% target next year?
There are too many variables combined, but I suppose it would be very hard for Korea to reach targeted inflation of 2%, though the pressure might be dissipated by the countervailing government policies. The BOK turns on the forecast of 2024, not that bright, but a little dimmer. The BOK maintained its GDP growth estimate for this year at 1.4%, but slashed it and adjusted next year to 2.1%. Meantime, the BOK board raised its price forecast for 2024 to 3%. They themselves forecasted 3%, which implies keeping a restrictive policy stance and confirming the need to tighten further, longer including monetary policies and geopolitical risk afterwards. Highly feasible scenario of 2024 might be Korea undergo a modest recovery of export amid slowing domestic demand growth. On the domestic demand side, private consumption and equipment investment remain subdued. Exports will be a moderate decline with semiconductor demand rebounding up, even though global trade momentum diminishes, mainly due to contracting of demand. Inflation trend changes into a declining trajectory, with losing momentum of employment expansion, notably within the service sector. As the global trade market is not recovered yet, surrounded by prolonged uncertainty, contractually trade structure still goes on in 2024. The decline of export will be slowed, but not recovered completely. Considering both domestic and external economic conditions, Korean economy will be projected to see a gradual deceleration in domestic demand growth. And as exports begin to rebound, the contraction in economic activity is expected to moderate in 2024.
All right. Thank you for your point of view, Professor Oh. Now, Professor Kim, we also need to talk about debt. Though the Bank of Korea froze the key benchmark rate at 3.5% on several occasions, the interest rate was indeed high for a long time, and this pushed Korea's combined household, business, and government debt to about $4.6 trillion this year alone. How concerning is this for our economy?
It can be concerning because in classic, the finance theory, there's the theory called debt overhang problem. It's not just a theory, actually, it is an important issue. The debt overhang problem is basically if the pre-existing debt is already high, then economic decision makers actually cannot make additional investment projects, or they cannot consume or smooth their consumption because the debt is already high, therefore they cannot make additional debt. And that actually really reduces the scope of their economic activities. And that's, I think, what we are somewhat facing with in case of South Korea, much more so for the corporate sector, especially small firms, and then even some of the large firms with really big debts. And but I think still also major issue is the household debt, especially with the real estates. And the government also has some issues, although it's much less actually severe. So clearly, this issue is big, especially if the new investment opportunities come up in the near future. So I think both Bank of Korea and the supervising committees, I think Korea should take a look at closely how the financial markets unwind, especially in terms of the debt market, corporate debt market, for instance, so that no domino type of effects actually is not going to happen, because contagion is very severe, actually, in case of financial market if something bad happens.
All right, we'll definitely have to tackle it. Now, Professor Oh, I'd like to ask you this. Many experts say the year 2024 is going to be very crucial in determining whether our economy will be on the path of sustained growth or face the risk of long-term stagnation. Could you give any advice for the South Korean economy to wisely get through the upcoming year?
Firstly, let me borrow a word from the OECD. Relatively longer perspective, it called on Korea to push for a measurement to bolster financial and fiscal soundness, given its rapid population aging. Against the backdrop of rapid population aging, spending pressures are not set to increase by approximately 5% of GDP by 2040, according to the OECD long-term model, driven by pension and health expenditure. But personally, we have to think to our very best to make a grand shift of the industry toward the digital transformation. That is an urgent top priority, I might say, to gain and retain momentum of economic growth. Digital innovation by forming an ecology system of digital startups could be a trailblazer of industrial innovation. It might also be efforts to lower productivity gaps between large companies and small and medium companies, expanding market and business scopes, and reducing labor market dualism, not going to extreme.
All right, I see your point. Now, Professor Kim, may I ask you the same question as well?
Well, I think Korea has been growing for the last 40, 50 years. And there were many crises and difficulties, but I think South Korea overcame pretty well, I think, this type of difficulties. I guess from now on, as Professor O mentioned, I think this new businesses actually will be very important, and also focusing on semiconductors and the things that we already do well, I think is very important to keep. What I actually would suggest a bit also is some of the industries that the other countries do not look at seriously should be the good potential industries that South Korea has to look at. After all, the South Korea grew by just looking at the industries that other advanced countries actually didn't look at. So such as like, some of these, for instance, like military spending, I think going to be important. So the military industry is going to be also important. Now we export. So I think we have to keep pushing. I know that the green energy is important, but at the same time, there's more brown energy sectors actually we shouldn't neglect, because more efficient brown industry is not going to go away. So those kind of things should be kept being invested, and those kind of things would be important to just to make the economy just to look better in the upcoming years, I believe.
All right, I see. So we would have to focus on some of the overlooked industries, such as military. All right, Professor Kim, thank you for your suggestion. Well, I'd like to ask many more questions, but unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Professor O and Professor Kim, for your time and insights.
Thank you
we
for
really
having me.
appreciate it. Thank you.
My pleasure.
All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.
Hello,